Good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Atkinson. I'm the Director of Arts, Humanities, and Languages at the University of California, San Diego Extension. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here for this opening event in our 2011-2012 series of the Revelle Forum. As always, I want to begin by thanking the Neuroscience Institute. They're our very gracious host for this series and provide the use of this beautiful hall to us and to other groups at no fee, so we thank them for that. Also want to mention the La Jolla Light, who provides a print media sponsorship for the series. And as you've all noticed, tonight we have two film crews here to document the program. As is our custom, we have UCSD TV filming, and they'll be filming the event for future broadcast and also web streaming. And then tonight we also are pleased to welcome a crew from C-SPAN's BookTV, and they'll be filming this for broadcast on C-SPAN. Our program tonight will be in interview format and will be followed by 15 to 20 minutes for questions from the audience, and we'll be taking your questions in written form on those index cards that were passed out as you came in. Our interviewer, Dr. Jennifer Burton, will select the questions and read them for Mr. Ford's response. And then at the conclusion of the question and answer period, we'll have a book signing, and the book signing table is here at the foot of the stage to my left. And as you've probably noticed, Mr. Ford's book is available for purchase at the entrance of the auditorium. Finally, please note, aside from the television crews, that is, no video recording, audio recording, or photography is permitted during tonight's event. And please also take a moment to turn off phones and other electronic devices. It's my pleasure now to introduce Jennifer Burton, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Burton is a visiting scholar at the University of California, San Diego, and she's also taught at the University of San Diego and at Harvard University, where she earned her PhD in English and American literature. She's active as an author and editor in a wide variety of genres, and is also a producer of independent films. Her latest book, entitled Call and Response: Key Debates in African American Studies, was co-edited with Henry Louis Gates, Jr., and was published in 2010. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Burton.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to welcome Richard Thompson Ford to the Revelle Forum. He is the George E. Osborne Professor of Law at Stanford Law School and is a regular contributor to Slate and has written for numerous newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. His first book, Racial Culture, published in 2005, critiques racial identity politics, including multiculturalism, while also strongly arguing for racial justice. In his second book, The Race Card, published in 2008 and selected as a New York Times notable book, Professor Ford argues that ubiquitous claims of discrimination, or playing the race card, are distracting attention away from serious racial injustice. He concludes that we need to, quote, begin by looking at racial injustice as a social problem to be solved collectively, rather than as a series of discrete wrongs perpetuated by bad people. This year, he has two books coming out. Universal Rights Down to Earth, which analyzes human rights struggles around the world and argues for the need to shift from trying to observe universal principles and instead engage locally with local institutions, laws, and social relationships in order to bring about meaningful change. And Rights Gone Wrong, how law corrupts the struggle for equality that we'll be focusing on today, and which the Kirkus Review calls a crisp analysis of the limits of our civil rights laws and a prescription for how to move beyond them. I work on African American history, as Dan said, and recently reviewed the history of African American debate with Henry Louis Gates in our book, Call and Response. And from my perspective, one of the most striking things about Rich's work is his ability to pull back and look at long-running debates from a fresh vantage point. This is particularly important in our time of polarized politics, when so many debates are reduced to little more than alternating talking points. And while he grapples with conservative and liberal ideas, he maintains an eye on the greater social good. He also has a strong sense of history, which comes through in his discussions of the powerful and important role that civil rights legislation has played in eliminating legal discrimination in America, and also in his critique that current civil rights cases have moved us away from the historical basis for civil rights legislation as a route toward eliminating group discrimination. Many of you may have seen the stellar review of Rights Gone Wrong in yesterday's New York Times. George Washington law professor Jeff Rosen writes, Ford does not offer an equivocal, cautious, middle-of-the-road critique of civil rights law. His book is sharp and surprising and casts the discrimination debate in a clarifying new light. Will you join me in welcoming Richard Thompson Ford? In his New York Times review of your last book, The Race Card, Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson praised your work, writing, "The end result is a vigorous and long overdue shakeup of the nation's stale discourse on race." In this new book, is it motivated by stale ideas that you think need shaking up?
In a sense, yes. I want to attack the idea that every social injustice is a civil rights issue. And I think since the 1960s in particular, there's a very powerful tendency to think of social injustice issues almost exclusively in terms of civil rights. The result has been that a wide range of disparate issues with different causes that are in many ways incommensurable are kind of being shoehorned into a single approach, an approach that tends to focus on bias, on bigots, on discrimination as the central evil. And I think that's been bad. Another consequence has been an over-reliance on courts and on legalistic arguments as a mechanism for dealing with social injustice, and a relative lack of attention to other forms, everything from public persuasion, changing hearts and minds, to also the legislative process, the popular branches of government. And so the result has been a narrowing of imagination about how to think about social injustice, and a narrowing of imagination in thinking about potential solutions. And those are the kind of ideas that I do think that they're stale ideas. I think they're ideas that are important and play an important role, but have been kind of occupied the field and crowded out other ways of thinking about the issues.
Oh, interesting. That sort of ties into something you write about in the race card, of this idea of racism without racists. Can you talk about that a little bit? Is that connected, something that you're moving on and connecting with this book?
Yes, absolutely. So the idea of racism without racists, as I see it, is that many of the most severe social injustices, particularly in the area of race, but also in many other areas that are addressed by civil rights laws and civil rights type legislation, don't involve bigots or racists, or at least they don't. The bigots and racists and bias, animus, are not the main causes any longer. Instead, what we have are problems that are much more complex in nature, that are the result of the legacy of past discriminatory practices, but perhaps not contemporary racists or bigots. Cases in which, if there is bigotry, it's very difficult to detect. In some cases may even be unconscious. In cases in which there are a range of other social forces and institutional day-to-day practices that may in some sense be innocent, but at least innocent in terms of intent, in terms of the mental state of people engaging in those practices, but nevertheless perpetuate injustices. And it's this kind of second generation of racial injustice and social injustice that we most desperately calls out for new approaches.
Okay. What would be a specific example of something that you think we need a different kind of approach to confront?
Well, and one example involves the very high incarceration rates of African American men. There's a great deal of data about this. To my mind, it's one of the most severe remaining legacies of America's long, sad history of overt racial discrimination. And yet, it can now I don't want to suggest that there are no racist police, no racist prosecutors. There certainly are, but the extent of the disparity can't be explained by old school Jim Crow style bigotry. Instead, you have a collection of